A millionaire fired his secretary, thinking she was useless. What she did next left him speechless. The tension in the room was so thick, it could be cut with a knife. Natalie Hayes sat stiffly in her seat, her fingers gripping the arms of the chair, as if the plush leather beneath her might swallow her whole. Across the desk, Grayson leaned back in his chair, his sharp suit impeccable, his tie slightly loosened in a gesture of casual dominance. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the massive glass windows of his corner office, casting long shadows over the polished mahogany desk that separated them. "You're a liability, Natalie," Ethan declared, his voice calm but laced with that familiar arrogance. His eyes, piercing and calculating, scanned her face for a reaction. "Frankly, you're lucky you've lasted this long." The words hit her like a slap, but she refused to let it show. Years of working under his condescending gaze had taught her how to mask her emotions. She straightened her back, her jaw tightening just enough to signal defiance without outright rebellion. "A liability?" she asked, her voice steady. "After 7 years of loyalty? After doing everything you asked? Even the things that weren't in my job description?" Ethan's lips curved into a smirk, the kind that always made her stomach churn. "Loyalty?" he echoed. "Loyalty doesn't matter when the company's future is at stake. You're replaceable, Natalie. It's nothing personal." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. Nothing personal? For 7 years, she had been the one organizing his life, smoothing over his impulsive decisions, keeping his temper in check during heated board meetings, and covering up the skeletons he thought no one knew about. She had given everything to this job, and now he was tossing her aside as if she were yesterday's newspaper. But Natalie didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her green eyes locking onto his in a way that made him falter, if only for a second. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon," Ethan chuckled, brushing off her words as if they were nothing more than the bitter ramblings of a disgruntled employee. "Let's not make this dramatic, Natalie. You'll get your severance package, and I'll even throw in a glowing recommendation. But this," he gestured vaguely between them, "this ends here." She rose slowly, smoothing the creases from her modest navy dress. Her movements were deliberate, each one a calculated measure of control. "I'll clear my desk by the end of the day," she said, her voice even. "But remember this, Ethan, power doesn't last forever. One day, you'll find yourself on the other side of the desk." He scoffed, waving her off as if her words were beneath him. "I'll take my chances." As Natalie walked out of his office, the door clicking shut behind her, she allowed herself one fleeting moment of vulnerability. She pressed her back against the cool surface of the door, inhaling deeply to steady the storm raging inside her. The whispers of her colleagues reached her ears, speculative, pitying, and tinged with schadenfreude. She ignored them, walking to her desk with her head held high. Her desk was a small oasis of order in the chaos of the office, a testament to her meticulous nature. She began packing her belongings methodically, her mind already racing through the next steps. She wasn't just leaving a job today. She was setting the stage for something far greater. Among the personal items she packed were the carefully organized files she had collected over the years, documents, emails, and records Ethan thought had disappeared into the void. She had kept them not out of malice, but as a safeguard. Now, they would become the foundation of her next move. Back in his office, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head as he stared out over the city skyline. From his vantage point, New York stretched out like a glittering jewel, a playground for the rich and powerful, where he was king. Firing Natalie was just another decision in a long line of ruthless choices that had propelled him to the top. 7 years, he muttered to himself, a hint of amusement in his tone. She lasted longer than most. He reached for his whiskey decanter, pouring himself a generous glass. To him, people like Natalie were interchangeable, cogs in the machine of his empire. Loyalty, dedication, they were admirable traits, sure, but ultimately expendable when weighed against the company's bottom line. Ethan believed in one thing above all else, control. And Natalie, with her sharp tongue and unyielding determination, had started to feel like a threat to that control. As he sipped his drink, his phone buzzed on the desk. A message from his assistant. Ms. Hayes has left the building. Good, he thought. One less distraction. Later that evening, Natalie sat alone in her small apartment, the city's hum muted through the thick windows. Her desk was cluttered with papers, her laptop glowing softly as she combed through the files she had taken with her. Each document was a piece of a puzzle she had spent years assembling, and tonight, the final image was starting to come into focus. She thought of Ethan's smug face, his dismissive tone, and the way he had so casually stripped her of her livelihood. Anger flared within her, but she quickly pushed it aside. Anger was a distraction. She needed focus. Revenge wasn't about rage. It was about strategy, precision, and patience. On her laptop screen, a name blinked back at her. Evelyn Sinclair, one of the city's most elusive and powerful investors. Natalie had been working with her in secret for months, feeding her information and slowly building a case against Ethan. Now, with her termination, the final pieces were falling into place. A notification popped up. Meeting confirmed. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Natalie allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Ethan thought he had won, but he didn't realize that by dismissing her, he had set his own downfall into motion. The chapter ends with Natalie closing her laptop and leaning back in her chair. Her apartment is dimly lit, the shadows on her face highlighting her determination. She whispers softly to herself, a quiet vow. He's about to learn that the rules of the game can change. What would you have done in Natalie's shoes? Would you have walked away quietly or fought back against someone like Ethan? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more gripping narratives like this one. Ethan Grayson's office exuded the kind of power that only money could buy. The panoramic windows offered an uninterrupted view of Manhattan, a skyline that seemed to bow to his dominance. Everything about the space was curated to reflect his status. The Italian leather chairs, the handcrafted mahogany desk, even the faint scent of cedarwood lingering in the air. It wasn't just an office, it was his throne room, and he was its unchallenged ruler. As he adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of his glass cabinet, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The morning had started well. Natalie Hayes, his former secretary, was no longer his problem. Her efficiency had been admirable, but her increasing defiance had grated on him. She had started to overstep, to question his decisions, and Ethan had no patience for subordinates who didn't know their place. She was a loose thread, and he'd snipped it. Sitting at his desk, Ethan flipped through the agenda for the day. His assistant had already outlined the meetings, but he barely glanced at the details. He trusted his team to handle the minutiae. Delegation was one of his strengths, after all. He only concerned himself with the big picture. Profits, acquisitions, and staying one step ahead of the competition. His phone buzzed, and he answered without looking at the caller ID. Grayson. Ethan. It's Richard from the board, came the voice on the other end. Richard McAllister, a senior board member and longtime ally, rarely called directly. That alone was enough to make Ethan's brow furrow. What is it? Ethan asked, his tone sharp. There was a pause, the kind that hinted at bad news. We've been reviewing the latest financials, and there's a slight dip in the numbers from last quarter. Nothing catastrophic, but it's raising some eyebrows. Ethan leaned back in his chair, annoyance flashing in his eyes. A dip? That's expected with the recent market fluctuations. It's temporary. It's not just that, Richard continued, his tone careful. There's some concern about the way we're handling certain partnerships. A few investors are starting to question whether the aggressive tactics we've been using are sustainable. Ethan's jaw tightened. Aggressive tactics are what built this company, Richard. Tell them to stop whining and focus on the returns. Richard hesitated, and Ethan could practically hear the man weighing his next words. Ethan, I'm on your side, but you've made some powerful enemies over the years. The board is loyal, but loyalty has its limits if the numbers don't hold up. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Are you questioning my leadership? Not at all, Richard said quickly. Just tread carefully. There's more at stake than just your pride. The line went dead, and Ethan stared at the phone in his hand, his frustration mounting. Enemies. Of course he had enemies. Anyone who achieved his level of success did. But Richard's warning gnawed at him. Loyalty had limits. He needed to ensure those limits were never tested. Ethan rose from his desk and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. From up here, everything seemed so small, so insignificant. He had clawed his way to the top, starting with nothing but ambition and a sharp mind. His rivals underestimated him, his partners feared him, and his employees obeyed him. That was how he liked it. Control was everything, but control required vigilance. As he stared out at the sprawling metropolis, his thoughts drifted back to Natalie. Her parting words had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Power doesn't last forever," she had said. It was nonsense, of course. Power lasted as long as you were willing to fight for it. Still, the calm confidence in her tone lingered in his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Shaking off the thought, Ethan returned to his desk. He had more important matters to focus on. The first meeting of the day was with the board, and he needed to project absolute confidence. Perception was everything in the corporate world, and Ethan was a master at maintaining his image. The boardroom was a study in modern elegance, with sleek lines and muted tones that conveyed sophistication without being ostentatious. Ethan took his place at the head of the table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The other board members exchanged polite greetings, their expressions carefully neutral. Ethan noted their body language, subtle shifts in posture, lingering glances at their phones, and filed it away for later analysis. "Let's get started," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of small talk. The meeting began with the usual updates, quarterly reports, projections, and discussions of upcoming projects. Ethan listened with half an ear, his focus on the undercurrents of the conversation. He could sense a growing unease among the board members, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Ethan," one of the members, a woman named Margaret, spoke up, "there's been some concern about the turnover rate in your department. Several key executives have left in the past 6 months, and we're starting to see ripple effects." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Turnover is a natural part of business," he replied smoothly. "We've already begun recruiting top talent to fill those roles." Margaret raised an eyebrow. Even so, the departures have raised questions about the company's culture. Some of the investors are wondering if there's a deeper issue. "There is no issue," Ethan said firmly. "The company is performing better than ever, and our strategies are sound. If the investors have concerns, they're welcome to address them directly with me." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethan's gaze swept across the table, daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. The meeting continued, but the tension remained. By the time it ended, Ethan's patience was wearing thin. As the board members filed out, Richard lingered behind. "You handled that well," Richard said, his tone measured. Ethan glanced at him. "Did you expect anything less?" Richard hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but you should keep an eye on Margaret. She's been talking to some of the investors behind the scenes." Ethan's expression darkened. "I'll deal with it." Back in his office, Ethan poured himself another drink. The board's concerns were an irritant, but nothing he couldn't handle. He had faced bigger challenges before. Still, something about today's meeting left a bitter taste in his mouth. The loyalty he had always relied on seemed to be wavering, and that was unacceptable. As he sipped his whiskey, his mind returned to Natalie once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that her departure had set something in motion, a chain reaction he couldn't yet see. She had been a constant in his life for years, always there to clean up his messes and keep things running smoothly. Without her, the cracks in his empire were starting to show. Ethan dismissed the thought, turning his attention to his next meeting. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The future was all that mattered, and he would do whatever it took to maintain his grip on power. But as the day wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath him was shifting. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest hint of unease, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his early days in the business world. He pushed it aside, reminding himself that he was Ethan Grayson and nothing could bring him down. Or so he thought. The sun had barely risen over the Manhattan skyline, casting long shadows over the crowded streets below. In her modest apartment nestled in the quieter outskirts of the city, Natalie Hayes sat at her small dining table, a steaming cup of coffee cradled between her hands. The soft hum of morning traffic floated through the open window, blending with the rustle of leaves from the lone tree outside. Despite the serenity of the morning, Natalie's mind was a storm of carefully calculated moves and strategic planning. Yesterday, Grayson had severed her from the company she had devoted 7 years of her life to. But as she sat there, reflecting on the chain of events that had led her here, there was no bitterness, only a steely resolve. Ethan thought he had stripped her of everything, but he had merely set the stage for her next act. Natalie reached for the stack of documents spread across her table. The papers, neatly organized in color-coded folders, were the culmination of months of covert preparation. Financial reports, acquisition contracts, and internal communications, all documenting the ethically gray decisions Ethan had made to climb the corporate ladder. While others might have discarded these as mundane paperwork, Natalie saw them as ammunition. The decision to gather this information hadn't been made lightly. Natalie's father had always warned her about the ruthless nature of the business world. She had grown up watching him struggle, his small business slowly suffocated by corporate predators like Ethan. When his company finally collapsed under the weight of an unjust buyout, it broke him. Natalie had promised herself that she would never be powerless again. She would learn the game, master it, and use it to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The irony was almost poetic. Ethan had fired her, considering her just another expendable asset. Yet, it was his arrogance, his unwavering belief in his own invincibility, that had allowed her to gather the very evidence she now held in her hands. He had underestimated her, seeing only a secretary, never realizing the formidable adversary she could become. A knock at her door pulled Natalie from her thoughts. She rose, crossing the small living room to answer it. Standing there was Evelyn Sinclair, a woman whose reputation in the investment world was both revered and feared. Elegant in a tailored suit, Evelyn's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Natalie," Evelyn greeted, a small, approving smile playing on her lips. "I trust you're ready?" Natalie stepped aside, allowing Evelyn into the apartment. "More than ever," she replied, closing the door softly behind them. They sat together at the table, the weight of their collaboration palpable. Evelyn had been instrumental in helping Natalie navigate the intricacies of hostile takeovers and strategic investments. The two women had formed a bond rooted in mutual respect and a shared disdain for the unchecked greed of men like Ethan. "Everything is in place," Evelyn began, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against the folders. "We've secured controlling interest in Grayson Enterprises through multiple shell corporations. Ethan has no idea how exposed he truly is." Natalie's lips curved into a slight smile. "He fired me without a second thought. He thinks that's the end of it." Evelyn's eyes glinted with something akin to admiration. Men like Ethan always think they're untouchable. It's their greatest weakness. For the next few hours, they discussed the final steps of their plan. Natalie's heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the power Ethan had tried to strip from her and using it to reshape the very company he had built on the backs of others. As they wrapped up their meeting, Evelyn paused, her expression turning serious. "You understand that once we go public with this, there's no turning back?" Natalie met her gaze head-on. "I've spent years watching him destroy lives without consequence. It's time he understands the cost of his actions." Evelyn nodded, satisfied. "Then let's make sure he does." After Evelyn left, Natalie took a moment to breathe, steadying herself for the storm ahead. She glanced around her apartment, the simplicity of her surroundings a stark contrast to the opulence of Ethan's world. Yet, this space was filled with authenticity, a reflection of who she was and the journey she had undertaken. As the day wore on, Natalie's confidence only grew. She reached out to old colleagues, subtly gathering their support. Many of them had their own grievances with Ethan, and with a little encouragement, they were eager to back her. Each conversation reinforced her belief that she wasn't alone in this battle. There were many who wanted to see Ethan held accountable. Late into the evening, Natalie found herself revisiting memories she had long buried. The early days at Grayson Enterprises, when she had been eager to prove herself in the corporate world. Ethan had initially appeared as a mentor, his charisma masking the manipulative tendencies beneath. But as the years passed, his true nature revealed itself in every ruthless decision and every belittling remark. Natalie had learned quickly, absorbing everything, becoming indispensable while secretly preparing for the day she would challenge him. Now, as the city lights flickered outside her window, she knew that day had come. The plan was simple in its elegance: expose Ethan's unethical practices, seize control of the company, and rebuild it into something that served its employees and investors honestly. She wasn't interested in destroying the company, only in saving it from the man who had poisoned it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. A text from Evelyn flashed on the screen. "It's time. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Natalie's heart raced, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. She placed the phone down and stood, stretching her weary muscles. Tomorrow would be the culmination of years of work, the day she proved that power didn't belong solely to those who flaunted it, but also to those who earned it. Before heading to bed, Natalie paused by her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked into her own eyes, seeing the woman she had become, strong, determined, and ready to reclaim what had been stolen from her and her family. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a gentle reminder of why she had chosen this path. With one last deep breath, Natalie whispered to her reflection, "Tomorrow, everything changes." As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the city outside buzzed with its usual chaotic rhythm. But inside Natalie's apartment, there was only the sound of her resolute heartbeat and the anticipation of the reckoning to come. The boardroom buzzed with an unusual tension. Executives shuffled in their chairs, adjusting ties and smoothing out papers as though the act might hide their unease. The walls, typically silent witnesses to routine meetings, seemed almost alive with the weight of unspoken speculation. Ethan Grayson's arrival, as always, was a spectacle. He strode into the room with the confidence of a man who believed the universe itself bent to his will. His custom-tailored suit fit perfectly, a reflection of the control he prided himself on. He barely acknowledged the murmured greetings, heading straight for his seat at the head of the table. The chair, larger and more ornate than the others, was a not-so-subtle symbol of his authority. Ethan's presence commanded the room, his sharp gaze scanning each face as though daring anyone to challenge him. "All right," he began, his voice slicing through the low hum of conversation. "Let's get started." But before the meeting could officially commence, the door swung open. The sudden intrusion caused several heads to turn, and a hush fell over the room as Natalie Hayes stepped inside. Ethan froze mid-sentence, his initial shock quickly masked by a thin veneer of annoyance. "Natalie," he said, his tone sharp, "what are you doing here? This is a closed meeting." Natalie didn't flinch. She walked into the room with a measured pace, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was dressed simply, in a sleek black blazer and matching trousers, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about her. She met Ethan's gaze with unwavering confidence, her green eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite place. "Good morning, everyone," she said, addressing the room with a calm, composed smile. "I believe my presence here will make things clearer." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against the table in barely contained irritation. "I don't know what kind of stunt this is, but—" "Mr. Grayson," a voice interrupted from the far end of the table. It was Margaret, one of the more outspoken board members. She held up a folder, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps it's best if we let Ms. Hayes explain." Ethan's eyes darted to Margaret, his irritation morphing into suspicion. He glanced around the table, noting the shared glances and subtle nods among the board members. Something was wrong, something he hadn't foreseen. Natalie placed her hands on the back of an empty chair, leaning slightly forward. "I appreciate the opportunity," she began, her voice steady. "Let me cut to the chase. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Grayson Enterprises." The room fell into a stunned silence. Ethan's expression flickered, disbelief flashing across his face before he masked it with a scoff. "That's impossible," he said, leaning back in his chair as though to dismiss her claim. You don't have the resources for that. Natalie smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. You're right, she replied. I don't, but I've spent the last 6 months working with investors who do. Investors who share my vision for this company. As of 8 a.m. today, we've acquired a controlling interest. Margaret slid the folder across the table toward Ethan, who hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the documents, the color draining from his face as the reality sank in. It was all there. Proof of the transactions, the shell corporations, the silent takeovers. She had outmaneuvered him in his own domain. This is a joke, Ethan said, his voice low and laced with venom. You think you can walk in here and take what I built? What you built? Natalie repeated, arching an eyebrow. She straightened, her gaze sweeping the room. Let's talk about what you built, Ethan. A culture of fear, manipulation, and greed. You've alienated employees, ignored investors, and taken shortcuts at every opportunity. This company isn't thriving because of you. It's surviving in spite of you. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their silence speaking volumes. Ethan's carefully constructed image was beginning to crack, and Natalie wasn't about to let up. Under your leadership, she continued, Grayson Enterprises has lost credibility in the market. You've sacrificed long-term growth for short-term gains, and you've treated people like disposable assets. That ends today. Ethan's temper flared. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to lecture me about leadership, he snapped. I built this empire from the ground up. You were just a secretary, an employee who should have been grateful for the opportunity. Natalie met his outburst with unflinching composure. I was a secretary, she said, her voice calm but firm. And while you dismissed me as nothing more than that, I was learning, watching, preparing. You gave me access to everything, Ethan. Every deal, every misstep, every opportunity. You gave me the tools to take you down. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to respond, but Margaret spoke first. Natalie's right, she said, her tone measured. We've raised concerns about your decisions for months, Ethan. This isn't just about Natalie. It's about the future of this company. And frankly, we're starting to believe it's a future that doesn't include you. The words landed like a blow, and Ethan staggered under their weight. He had always seen himself as untouchable, the master of his own fate. Yet here he was, blindsided and cornered in his own boardroom. Natalie stepped closer, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. You taught me one thing, Ethan, she said. Power isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who listens, who adapts, and who builds something that lasts. You taught me that by being everything a leader shouldn't be. Ethan stared at her, his mind racing for a way out, a counterattack, anything to regain the upper hand. But there was no move left to make. Natalie had one. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with the board voting unanimously to install Natalie as interim CEO. Ethan sat in stunned silence as the room emptied, the once loyal allies who had followed his lead now avoiding his gaze. When the door finally closed, leaving him alone in the cavernous boardroom, Ethan felt the full weight of his defeat. The empire he had built, the power he had wielded so effortlessly, was no longer his to control. But as the minutes ticked by, a new emotion began to stir within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, or even fear. It was desperation. For the first time in his career, Ethan Grayson didn't know what to do next. The once imposing office of Ethan Grayson felt cavernous now, the silence oppressive as he sat alone at his desk. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. The power he had wielded so confidently just days ago had slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving behind nothing but the echo of Natalie's words and the weight of his failures. His gaze drifted to the skyline beyond the glass windows, a view that had once filled him with pride and a sense of dominion. Now, it seemed cold and indifferent, a constant reminder of a city that would carry on without him. The empire he had spent years building was no longer his. It had been taken from him by the very person he had dismissed as inconsequential. The irony was almost too much to bear. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the motion uncharacteristically restless. He had always prided himself on being composed, unflappable. But now, his thoughts were a tangle of frustration, regret, and a gnawing sense of dread. Natalie had outplayed him at every turn, and no matter how much he hated to admit it, she had earned her victory. She had been watching, learning, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And he, blinded by his own arrogance, had given her all the tools she needed. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen displayed Richard's name, and Ethan hesitated before answering. He wasn't in the mood for another lecture from his longtime ally turned reluctant critic, but avoiding the call would only make things worse. "Richard," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Ethan," Richard replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I just left the boardroom. The transition is moving ahead smoothly." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Smoothly," he repeated bitterly. "I'm glad everyone is so enthusiastic about my downfall." Richard sighed. "You know it's not about that. The board isn't against you, Ethan, but they had to act in the company's best interest. Natalie presented a strong case, and the truth is, your recent decisions made it hard to defend you." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Spare me the diplomacy, Richard. If you have something to say, just say it." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a hesitant but firm response. "You underestimated her, Ethan. We all did. Natalie isn't just some disgruntled employee. She's smart, resourceful, and, frankly, she's shown more leadership in the past few days than you have in months. If you want any chance of salvaging your reputation, you need to acknowledge that." Ethan's chest tightened at the words, though he knew they were true. He had underestimated Natalie, dismissed her as nothing more than a cog in the machine. And now, that oversight had cost him everything. "Thanks for the pep talk," he said dryly, ending the call before Richard could respond. He tossed the phone onto the desk and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. As the hours dragged on, Ethan found himself replaying the events of the past few days, searching for the moment when everything had begun to unravel. He thought back to the first meeting where Natalie had announced her takeover, the shock of seeing her stride into the boardroom with the confidence of someone who knew she had already won. He had been blindsided, unprepared for the precision and ruthlessness with which she had dismantled his defenses. And then there were her words, cutting, deliberate, and devastating. She had exposed not only his professional failures, but also the personal flaws he had worked so hard to hide. For years, Ethan had convinced himself that his success justified his methods, that the sacrifices he demanded from others were necessary for the greater good. But Natalie's indictment of his leadership had forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. His empire was built on a foundation of exploitation and arrogance. The thought made his stomach churn, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He needed a plan, a way to regain control before it was too late. Desperation clawed at him as he considered his options. He could fight Natalie in court, challenge the legality of her takeover. But even as the idea formed, he dismissed it. She had been too meticulous, too careful. She wouldn't have moved forward without ensuring every detail was airtight. That left only one option: confrontation. It was late evening when Ethan arrived at the office building, the city lights casting a faint glow over the polished glass exterior. The usually bustling lobby was quiet, the only sound the soft echo of his footsteps as he made his way to the elevator. He had rehearsed what he would say a dozen times on the drive over, but as the elevator doors slid shut, he felt the familiar gnaw of doubt creeping in. When he reached the top floor, the sight of Natalie's office stopped him in his tracks. The space had already been transformed, the decor minimalist yet inviting, a stark contrast to the cold opulence of his own office. It was a subtle but deliberate statement, one that told him she wasn't just taking his position, she was redefining it. Ethan knocked on the open door, his presence announced by the sharp sound. Natalie looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching taut between them. "Ethan," she said finally, her tone neutral, "what brings you here?" He stepped inside, his hands shoved into his pockets to keep them from trembling. "We need to talk." Natalie gestured to the chair opposite her desk, but Ethan remained standing. His gaze flicked to the files spread across her desk, a reminder of just how much control she now wielded. "I underestimated you," he admitted, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "I didn't see what you were capable of until it was too late." Natalie leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but guarded. "And now that you see it?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I want to fix this," he said finally. "I don't know how, but I can't just walk away. This company, it's all I have." Natalie's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You don't get to walk in here and act like the victim, Ethan. Everything that's happening now is a result of your choices. You didn't just underestimate me, you underestimated everyone around you. You took people for granted, used them as stepping stones, and now you're surprised that they're not loyal to you." Her words stung, but Ethan didn't argue. She was right, and he knew it. "I made mistakes," he said quietly. "I won't deny that, but I want to make things right." Natalie studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Making things right isn't about words, Ethan. It's about actions. You've spent years tearing people down. If you want to fix this, start by rebuilding what you destroyed." Ethan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of clarity, a sense of direction in the chaos. He didn't know if he could repair the damage he had done, but he knew he had to try. As he turned to leave, Natalie's voice stopped him. "Ethan," he paused, glancing back at her. "This isn't about redemption," she said. "It's about accountability. Don't come back here unless you're ready to take responsibility for everything." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words heavy on his shoulders. As he left the office, the city lights outside seemed colder than before, their glow a stark reminder of the empire he had built and the price he was now paying for it. The silence in Ethan Grayson's penthouse was suffocating. The sprawling, luxurious apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt hollow, the glossy surfaces and designer furniture mere ornaments in a life that was unraveling. He sat on the edge of the leather couch, a tumbler of whiskey balanced in his hand. The golden liquid caught the faint glow of the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but even the sight of the skyline failed to soothe him. Ethan's mind churned, replaying his encounter with Natalie Hayes earlier that evening. The words she had spoken still echoed in his head. "This isn't about redemption. It's about accountability." For years, Ethan had operated under the belief that his ambition justified his actions. He had crushed competitors, silenced dissenters, and dismissed anyone who didn't align with his vision. But Natalie's calculated revenge had exposed a truth he couldn't ignore. His empire was built on the backs of those he had exploited. The realization was like a splinter buried deep beneath his skin, festering and impossible to remove. He had tried to bury the guilt, to drown it in work and whiskey, but it clung to him, refusing to let go. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt powerless, and he hated it. A sharp knock at the door broke the oppressive quiet. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing as he rose to answer it. Visitors were rare these days. His social circle had all but evaporated in the wake of his downfall. He opened the door to find Richard standing there, a grim expression on his face. "Richard," Ethan said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you." Richard entered without a word, his gaze sweeping the apartment before settling on Ethan. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. Ethan gestured toward the couch, though he already knew the conversation would be anything but comfortable. Richard sat down, his posture tense, and fixed Ethan with a piercing stare. "You're spiraling," Richard began bluntly, "and if you don't get a handle on it, you're going to lose more than just the company." Ethan sank into the armchair opposite him, his jaw tightening. "I've already lost the company," he said bitterly. "Natalie made sure of that." Richard shook his head. "This isn't about Natalie. It's about you. You've spent your entire career bulldozing through people, acting like the rules don't apply to you. And now that the tables have turned, you're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself instead of doing something about it." Ethan bristled at the rebuke, but he couldn't deny the truth of Richard's words. "What do you suggest I do?" he asked, his voice edged with frustration. "Natalie has the board on her side. The investors trust her, And I'm nothing. You're not nothing, Richard said firmly. But you need to start acting like the man who built this company, not the one who tore it down. You still have influence, Ethan. You still have a chance to prove that you're more than the sum of your mistakes. Ethan stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. For years, he had equated power with control, with the ability to bend others to his will. But Natalie's calculated dismantling of his empire had revealed a different kind of power, one rooted in integrity and accountability. If he was going to reclaim any part of his life, he would have to learn to wield that kind of power, even if it meant starting from nothing. The days that followed were a blur of introspection and tentative action. Ethan began reaching out to old colleagues, not to demand favors, but to seek understanding. He wanted to know how his decisions had impacted them, how his relentless drive for success had shaped their lives. The conversations were humbling, each one a stark reminder of the collateral damage he had left in his wake. One evening, Ethan found himself standing outside a modest brownstone in Brooklyn. The address belonged to Karen Lee, a former employee who had worked in his marketing department years ago. She had left abruptly, citing personal reasons, but Ethan now suspected his management style had played a role. He hesitated before knocking on the door, unsure of what he hoped to achieve. When Karen answered, her surprise was evident. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression wary. "Ethan Grayson," she said, her tone equal parts incredulous and skeptical. "What brings you here?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "I wanted to talk," he said. About the time you worked at Grayson Enterprises." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I owe you an apology," Ethan admitted, his voice quiet. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about the way I treated people, and I realize now that I pushed too hard, expected too much, and never stopped to consider how it affected those around me. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make things right." Karen studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "It's a little late for apologies, don't you think?" "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I have to try." Karen sighed, stepping aside to let him in. They sat at her kitchen table, the conversation awkward at first, but gradually easing into something more genuine. Ethan listened as Karen recounted her experiences, both the opportunities she had gained and the sacrifices she had made under his leadership. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions, and it humbled him. By the time he left, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. The road to redemption would be long and arduous, but he was beginning to see a path forward. Meanwhile, Natalie watched from the sidelines as Ethan began to rebuild himself. She had expected him to lash out, to fight her takeover with every weapon in his arsenal. Instead, he had surprised her. His approach was quieter, more reflective, and it left her wondering if he was truly capable of change. But Natalie wasn't ready to let her guard down. She had spent too many years being underestimated, and she wasn't about to make the same mistake with Ethan. She remained vigilant, overseeing the company's operations with the precision and care that had defined her career. Under her leadership, Grayson Enterprises began to stabilize, its fractured foundation slowly mending. Still, there were moments when Natalie found herself questioning her own motives. Was this about justice, or had it become something more personal? Ethan's downfall had brought her a sense of closure, but it hadn't erased the pain of the past. And as she watched him struggle to find his footing, she couldn't help but wonder if she had become the very thing she despised, a person who wielded power without compassion. The turning point came one night when Natalie was working late in her office. She was reviewing financial reports when her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Ethan, the subject line simple. "Thank you?" Curious, she opened the message and read his words. "Natalie, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that your actions have forced me to confront things I've spent my whole life avoiding. You've made me see the man I've become, and for that, I am grateful. I don't know what the future holds, but I promise to be better. Not for the company, but for the people I've hurt, and for myself. Thank you for giving me the push I needed, even if it came at a cost." Natalie stared at the screen, her emotions a tangle of satisfaction, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. She closed the email and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the moment settling over her. The game she had started was nearing its end, but the question remained. What would she do next? The conference room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Natalie Hayes sat at the head of the long table, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension crackling in the air. Papers were neatly arranged in front of her, and the faint light from the large windows caught the edges of her watch as she tapped her pen against the folder in front of her. Across the table sat Ethan Grayson, his face shadowed by the sinking evening light. The confident arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by something far more unsettling, a quiet desperation. This was the first time they had sat face to face since the boardroom showdown that had upended Ethan's life. Natalie had called the meeting, but she had deliberately kept its purpose vague. Now, as the room sat heavy with anticipation, she leaned forward, her fingers steepled under her chin. "I appreciate you coming," she began, her voice measured. "I imagine it wasn't easy." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" he replied, his tone laced with a bitter edge. "You hold all the cards." Natalie tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps. But this isn't about power, Ethan. It's about understanding." He frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Understanding what, exactly? That you've won? That I'm sitting here because you've left me no other options?" Her gaze didn't waver, and the steady calm in her eyes only seemed to unsettle him further. "No, Ethan," she said softly. "It's about understanding the cost of the choices we make." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan shifted in his chair, his discomfort palpable. He hated feeling like this, exposed, vulnerable, powerless. But deep down, he knew Natalie wasn't just toying with him. There was something more at play, something he couldn't quite grasp. Natalie reached for the folder in front of her and slid it across the table toward him. "Before we go any further, I want you to look at this." Ethan hesitated before picking it up. His fingers brushed against the edge of the folder, and for a brief second, he considered refusing. But curiosity, and the gnawing sense of inevitability, compelled him to open it. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes, all meticulously organized. As he flipped through the pages, his confusion deepened. "These are contracts," he said, glancing up at her. "Old acquisitions? What does this have to do with anything?" Natalie leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "Look closer." Ethan's brow furrowed as he turned to one of the photographs. It showed a modest office building, its windows cracked and its once bright sign faded. The name on the sign sent a jolt through him. Richards and Company. Logistics. The company name stirred something in the recesses of his memory, but he couldn't place it. "I don't understand," he said, his voice quieter now. "What am I looking at?" "You're looking at the company my father built," Natalie said, her tone calm but tinged with something darker. It was a small operation, but it was his pride and joy. He spent years building it from the ground up, pouring everything he had into it. Until you came along. Ethan froze, the air seeming to grow heavier around him. "What are you talking about?" Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. Richards and Company was struggling, yes, but it was salvageable. My father had clients, contracts. He just needed time to turn things around. And then your company launched a hostile acquisition. You bought out his clients, undercut his contracts, and left him with nothing. Within months, the business folded. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, the weight of her accusations settling over him. "I didn't," he started, but his voice faltered. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Natalie said, her voice sharper now. "Because it didn't matter to you. My father wasn't a person to you. He was an obstacle, and you eliminated him without a second thought." Ethan's hands trembled as he set the folder down. The memories were faint, blurred by years of similar deals and acquisitions. But as he searched his mind, fragments began to surface. A meeting with his legal team, a casual remark about absorbing the small fish, a congratulatory toast after the deal closed. He had seen it as just another victory, another notch in his belt. But for Natalie and her family, it had been the beginning of the end. I was just doing my job, he said weakly, the words ringing hollow even to his own ears. Natalie laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Your job? Your job destroyed my family, Ethan. My father sank into depression after the company folded. He spent months trying to find work, trying to keep our lives together. But it wasn't enough. He couldn't handle it. He took his own life. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes widening in shock. Natalie, her voice broke as she continued, her composure cracking for the first time. My mother had to sell our house to pay off the debts. I was 15, Ethan. I watched my family fall apart because of a decision you made without a second thought. The room felt suffocating, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. What could he possibly say to undo the damage he had caused? Natalie took a deep breath, regaining her composure. When I took the job at your company, I didn't plan on staying. But as I worked there, as I saw how you operated, I realized something. You were untouchable. People feared you, admired you, but no one held you accountable. And I decided that if no one else would do it, I would. Ethan's chest tightened, his breathing shallow. Is that what this is about? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Revenge? Natalie shook her head slowly. It's about justice. It's about making you see the people behind the numbers, the lives behind the deals. I don't care about ruining you, Ethan. I care about making sure you understand what you've done. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at the folder in front of him, his reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him, a man who had spent years chasing power at the expense of everything else. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. I can't undo what I've done, Natalie. I wish I could, but I can't. All I can do is try to be better, to make amends. Natalie studied him, her expression inscrutable. That's a start, she said quietly, but it's not enough. You have to live with the consequences of your actions, Ethan, and you have to do the work to rebuild what you've broken. Not for me, but for yourself. He nodded slowly, her words cutting through the fog of his guilt. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of accountability, the crushing responsibility of the choices he had made. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to who he was. As Natalie gathered her things and left the room, Ethan remained seated, staring at the folder on the table. The empire he had built was gone, but in its place was the possibility of something new. A chance to rebuild, not just his company, but himself. The city lights burned brightly through the penthouse windows, a kaleidoscope of colors painting the room in muted hues. Ethan Grayson sat at the edge of his couch, elbows resting on his knees, staring blankly at the untouched glass of water on the coffee table. He had exchanged whiskey for water recently. Small changes, small steps. It felt symbolic, like a penance for the excesses of his past, though it did little to ease the restless churn in his gut. The confrontation with Natalie had shattered something in him. The folder she had handed him, filled with irrefutable evidence of the lives he had ruined, was still on his desk. He hadn't been able to bring himself to read through it again, though its contents replayed in his mind on a cruel, endless loop. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He had spent years priding himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from business. It was how he had built his empire, how he had risen to the top in a world that rewarded ruthlessness. But Natalie's words had cracked the walls he had built around himself, exposing the fragile foundation beneath. He thought about her now, not as the adversary who had dismantled his empire, but as the woman who had forced him to confront the truth. Her strength, her determination, her relentless pursuit of justice. It was humbling, and it made him realize just how much he had underestimated her. You have to live with the consequences of your actions. The words echoed in his mind, a stark reminder that there was no shortcut to redemption. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring back the lives his ambition had destroyed. But perhaps there was still a way forward. Ethan rose from the couch and walked to his desk. He opened his laptop and began typing an email, a resignation letter addressed to the board of Grayson Enterprises. His title was symbolic at this point. Natalie had full control of the company, but stepping down felt like the right thing to do. It was an acknowledgement of his failures, a first step toward accountability. As he hit send, a strange sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was something, a beginning. The next day, Ethan stood outside the modest community center in Brooklyn, a far cry from the gleaming towers of Manhattan. His tailored suit felt out of place here, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to dress down. He carried a folder under his arm, its contents carefully prepared over the past few sleepless nights. Inside, a small group of people had gathered in the main hall, their voices a low hum of conversation. These were the former employees of Richards & Company, the company Ethan had dismantled all those years ago. Natalie had provided him with their contact information, though she had warned him that many wouldn't want to see him. As he stepped into the room, the conversation stopped. All eyes turned to him, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility in their gazes. Ethan cleared his throat, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. "I'm sure some of you recognize me," he began, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I'm Ethan Grayson. I was the CEO of Grayson Enterprises, the company that destroyed Richards & Company." There was a murmur of discontent, a few muttered curses. Ethan held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quickly. "I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted to come here today because I owe you all an apology and an explanation." He placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a series of documents, contracts, financial records, and a proposal he had spent days crafting. "I can't change what I did," he continued, "but I want to do whatever I can to make things right. I've set up a fund to help those of you who were impacted by the closure of Richards & Company. It won't erase the past, but it's a start." The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Some of the faces before him softened slightly, while others remained stony, their arms crossed in defiance. One man, older and with a deep scar across his cheek, finally stepped forward. "And why should we believe you?" he asked, his voice rough with anger. "You think throwing money at us will make up for what you did?" Ethan met the man's gaze, his own steady. "No," he said simply, "it won't. But it's not just money. I want to help rebuild what I destroyed. I've spoken with Natalie Hayes, and she's agreed to partner with me on this. Together, we want to create a new foundation, one that supports small businesses like yours, so what happened to Richards & Company never happens again." The man's expression remained skeptical, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of cautious hope. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softening. "I know I can't fix everything, but I'm here because I want to try. I owe you that much." Over the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into the work of rebuilding. He met with former employees, listened to their stories, and learned about the lives he had impacted in ways he had never imagined. Each conversation was a humbling reminder of the responsibility he had shirked for so long. But it was also a chance to make amends, one small step at a time. Natalie watched his progress from a distance, her initial skepticism giving way to a grudging respect. She had expected him to falter, to revert to the man who had once wielded power without thought for its consequences. But Ethan surprised her. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying, and that mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Natalie received a call from Ethan. She hesitated before answering, unsure of what he wanted. "Hi," he said when she picked up, his voice quieter than she remembered. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "For giving me the push I needed," he replied. "I know this doesn't make up for what I've done, but it feels like a start." Natalie was silent for a moment, her gaze drifting to the skyline outside her window. "It is a start," she said finally, "but it's up to you to keep going." "I will," he promised. "And Natalie, I hope one day you'll be able to forgive me." She didn't answer right away. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily, especially not for wounds as deep as hers. But as she hung up the phone, a faint smile tugged at her lips. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't as impossible as she had once believed. Months later, Ethan stood at a groundbreaking ceremony for a new community center funded by the foundation he and Natalie had established. The air was crisp, filled with the sound of laughter and conversation as people from the neighborhood gathered to celebrate. As Ethan looked out at the crowd, he spotted Natalie standing near the back, her arms crossed and a faint smile on her face. Their eyes met, and she gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. Ethan turned back to the microphone, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "Today isn't just about rebuilding," he said. "It's about moving forward. Together." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what mattered most to Ethan was the sense of purpose that had finally replaced the emptiness he had carried for so long. This was his second chance, and he was determined not to waste it.